The word terrorist is clearly overused and even misused by the media and government officials. Now, there are genuine terrorist organizations, but the media has created this image of the terrorist and portrayed it as a group of uneducated conservative extremists hiding up in the caves. The truth is that most attacks that have occurred in the US and Europe had well-thought geopolitical intentions. So what is terrorism? And what is the main intention behind an attack? Despite what most people think, terrorism is not really about mass murder. The primary goal of a terrorist attack is to strike fear and panic in the hearts and minds of ordinary citizens. It's all about the psychological impact rather than the physical damage. And when the targeted population responds with hysteria, its behavior becomes irrational, and so the perpetrators get a return on their physical attack. For example, when Americans were in panic and fear over the 9/11 attacks, the foreign policy of a superpower changed. The psychological impact of the attack was so strong that it resulted in the invasion of Afghanistan and, to some extent, the invasion of Iraq. And this was the reaction Al-Qaeda had wanted to provoke. Another example is the Madrid train bombings in 2004, just 3 days before the national elections. The fear and anger that the Spanish population experienced resulted that the ruling party lost power in the elections. Again, exactly what Al-Qaeda had hoped for. I think it's important to recognize that terrorists are not just a couple of extremists with long beards hiding in the caves. This is how Hollywood portrays them, but most terrorist organizations think 3 moves ahead. They are intelligent, resourceful, and formidable opponents. Most terrorist organizations do extensive planning and have geopolitical ambitions. They do a lot of calculations and understand the fundamentals of the human psychology. They know how to manipulate people and how to provoke countries. When we recognize this fact, the terrorist loses its mystique and we start to look at them from a pragmatic perspective. Another issue I want to highlight is the role of the media. Now, the mainstream is not at all that honorable or objective. These are companies, and as such, their primary interests are financial. For example, television channels are influenced by sponsors, gatekeepers, and what news attracts the most viewers. The thing is that negative news sells best. People are just not that interested in positive news. It has very little news value. Think about it. When was the last time you read anything positive? This mindset that negative news sells best is counterproductive when it comes down to terrorism. In most cases, the media makes a sensation about terrorist attacks, and this feeds the hysteria of the ordinary population. Every terrorist organization is aware of this fact. It started in the late 1960s and early 1970s when terrorist groups started to exploit the media to advance the psychological impact of their attacks. For example, the kidnappings and murders of the Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics in 1972. This attack was purely made for television. And this strategy really took off in the 2000s, and today the psychological impact of a terrorist attacks thrives in the internet. Nowadays, there is non-stop media exposure, and this allows people to tune in and follow the events minute by minute. This amount of media exposure allows the viewer to become secondary victims as the violence unfolds, because the propaganda of the attack becomes far larger than just those in the immediate vicinity. Just think about how watching the 9/11 attacks live on TV affected you at the time. Now, 24-hour media exposure is just how the modern media works, but more than often, the media deliberately builds a sensation around a terrorist attack. And the media is not alone in this. The internet can spread misinformation and fear very quickly over a large portion of the population. The scarier and crazier the story, the faster it spreads and the more the website earns from advertising revenues. So this kind of misinformation builds the hype and further reinforces the psychological intentions of the terrorist organizations. Even governments play along those psychological impacts. Sometimes it's deliberate and sometimes it's just premature warnings. For example, the threat level indicator of the US Department of Homeland Security, all it really did was to enforce the state propaganda by striking fear in the minds of citizens. Some people even acquired parachutes, gas masks, etc. And this kind of fear-based propaganda isn't exclusive to the American government. The French, the British, the Russians, pretty much every government in the world has used fear to mobilize an entire nation into a certain political design. We've seen this happen many times throughout history. Now, the circulation of fear is so strong that all bin Laden needed to do was make a video recording and make empty threats, and the media, the internet, or governments would do the rest. That's why even failed attacks are called a success by Al-Qaeda. For example, the underwear bombings in 2009, despite its failure, Al-Qaeda called it a success because the fear caused a disruption in the transportation of goods, and that resulted in economic damage. It wasn't even necessary to kill anyone. So how can we put a halt to terrorism? Well, we can't stop the attacks. The war on terror was already lost before it even started. Terrorism is like violence, disease, natural disasters. It is part of the human condition. But the image of terrorism, the idea of it, is much more dangerous than the actual physical attack. What we can do is remove the terror from terrorism. We need to contain our instincts of fear and hysteria. Just being aware that fear is what terrorists really want will help us reduce the impact of an attack. We also need to recognize that even though terrorists do not share our moral values, they are intelligent and their actions are meant to provoke us. It is the response of the population that really reflects the success of the attackers. This was a Caspian report by Mishirvan. Thank you for watching, and Sahol.